going to show you how to paint this little landscape in watercolor. Start with a light pencil line for your horizon, and then on the left-hand side, start to draw in that little mountain or hill, and then at the bottom, I just kind of bring in a straight horizontal line, make adjustments as needed. Your sketch can be relatively simple. And then here I'm going to add in some little rocks just to have them poke through the water, just to add a little bit of texture into the painting. And you can sort of add these in wherever you'd like to. And I just like to do different sizes and sort of overlap them. The first thing we're going to do is the background, and we are going to use a wet and wet technique to create a blend. I'm going to be using lemon yellow, magenta, and some ultramarine blue for my blend, but you can use any colors that you want. Use the biggest flat brush that you have that will fit the page, and then go ahead, dip that brush in water, and just coat your page lightly with some water to dampen it. This will help the blend that we're going to be creating. Next up, grab some lemon yellow with your brush. Bring lots of water into it. On a plastic palette, sometimes it feels like it disappears, but it's there. It just pools up on the plastic with the water. Then I'm going to bring in a little magenta into my lemon yellow to make an orange, and this is going to be my first color. Again, lots of water, so I can start with a wash, but you can always build up saturation with color through layers. Then I'm going to start with my flat brush and work in that color into the top of the page and let it sort of blend down. The water from the paper will just sort of carry it. I'm going to next wipe off my palette with some paper towel and then bring in some magenta. And then again, lots of water. I'm making more of a wash. I want this to feel pretty transparent. And then I'm going to paint that just underneath my first color, allowing them to blend. Now, the wet and wet technique is very natural. You don't have a ton of control over it, so you'll get some blends between the colors. Now, you can always go back and add in some of your original color if you want to soften that transition between the two. So you can adjust it slightly, but usually I like to just let it dry and see what that blend looks like. And then if you want to saturate the color a little bit more, you can always add in another layer. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off my palette again and grab an ultramarine blue for my third color. And then same process, I'm going to blend that in, allowing that paint to sort of go over the seam, creating a soft transition. And you can create more of a blend by working that seam a little bit more with your brush, but again, I just want it to be sort of a soft fade. I do want to see the sections of the color for mine, but again, you can adjust this and make it your own. There is no one way to do it. And feel free to grab more color if you need to, but what you'll see happening is the color blending. The blue with the magenta creates a little bit of a purple. And just so showing you on my finished piece there what that transition looks like when it's dry. Next, we're going to go ahead and let this dry for just a little bit before we paint the trees in the background. Now, how wet your paper is will determine how sort of faded those trees look. If you leave your paper slightly damp, they'll blend a little bit more with the wet on wet style, which is what I'm going to do in this video as compared to the sample I'm occasionally showing. I let the background dry a little bit more so the edges of the trees are just a little bit more crisp. So that's just an artistic choice. You can go ahead and do what you want. But first I'm going to go ahead and take a little purple. I mixed magenta and ultramarine blue to get this purple or violet color. And I'm going to go ahead with my smaller round brush, just painting sort of a little strip at the bottom there. And then I'm going to start bringing up a vertical line to make a tree. I make sort of an arrow at the top of the tree with like a little point, and then I sort of make a little triangular shape and start making little lines and flaring branches outward. Now, because the background is wet, I'm getting some soft blends and transitions, but I like that for this. It sort of makes it feel faded, like it's going back, as compared to this one, where there's a little bit more of a crisp edge. Again, I just let the background dry more. So artistic decision, you can decide if you want to let the background dry more, or if you just want to go ahead and paint right on top like I'm doing in this video. And then spacing is up to you. It depends if you want like a really dense feeling forest, or if you just want to space them out a little bit more, but these will fade into the background eventually as we start building trees on top. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up this process as I add in some more of these trees. Now I'm going to let that dry and start painting the water. And for the water, we will work in layers, but to get us started, I'm going to start with a ultramarine blue and a little bit of black to darken it. You could also do like a burnt umber or a little brown to darken a blue if you want to. And then I'm going to add lots of water, mix that up, create a wash. And I'm going to be using my flat paintbrush, and I'm going to be using sort of horizontal feeling strokes. I'm tapping the paintbrush off a little on my paper just so it doesn't create too much of a, it doesn't pool the water around, is what I'm trying to say. So I'm taking the brush and starting to create some strokes, and I noticed that little spot there I spilled. Luckily I caught it in time before it dried, and with a paper towel I was able to blot it back up. But continuing here with the water, I'm going to leave some little gaps of white poking through for little highlights, and then as I mentioned, I will be layering multiple blues and allowing that to overlap, letting it dry in between just so I can build up the layers rather than creating a full wet on wet technique, and having it all blend. I want to create a little bit of depth. Even though this is a pretty simple painting, not hyper realistic, I still like having a little bit of value. But I just take my time, overlap the strokes a little bit, allow areas to be a little lighter, a little bit of dark areas poking through, those highlights with the white of the paper, but allowing the strokes to overlap too and sort of blend together in areas. And you can adjust your blue here and there, but as I create more layers, I will also be adjusting it. So looking at my other sample here, you can see how adding layers adds dimension. So we will work towards that. But now what we can paint actually is our little hill there. And I'm going to be using some ivory black, but you could do another color if you want. I want a silhouette feel here with the idea that it's being backlit. So I'm taking and just kind of filling in this little hill area, just kind of using some different strokes, allowing the paint to be lighter and darker in areas. I'm actually going to do a little lifting with some paper towel here in a minute. So I'm just filling it in to get started. But add more water as needed, add more layers as needed. This can be as silhouetted as you want. But I like the idea of adding a little bit of texture, just as light might capture a rocky hill. There's parts sort of sticking out or going in a little bit. So grabbing a little bit of paper towel will create that effect. And you could also use a sponge, that could be interesting, or a dry paintbrush, but just sort of lifting some of the paint up while it's wet creates a little bit of simple texture. And then you can add some paint back in with your brush. I tried a few little flicks of paint here. It didn't really show up very much, but worth a shot. And then adding in a little bit more color with my brush, just sort of tapping some in. That way I've got some light areas, dark areas, and when that dries, you can certainly add more. I'm also grabbing a small round brush and filling in these rocks. Same idea. I can have some areas a little bit lighter, a little bit darker. I could lift a little bit with a paper towel or a dry paintbrush or a sponge if I want to. That's up to you. Again, you can make different artistic choices. It doesn't have to be exactly like this. Same with colors. Feel free to use different colors or change it up. It's more about the process of working back to front, bigger areas to smaller areas, and layering. So now what we can do is think about these trees. Now I do want to mention you want to make sure your background is dry. If it's not quite dry, you're going to get a blend. So do make sure your background is dry before you start these final trees. But I'm going to be using ivory black and just a small round paintbrush, a 0 or a 1, whatever works best for you. And I actually make the trees in a very similar way that I made the ones in the background. Just because my background is dry, these appear a little bit more crisp. And I'm slowing down a little bit just because I want them to feel like they're coming forward compared to the ones in the back. So I start with that vertical line, make it kind of look like an arrow, and then I start bringing some lines going out. Pine trees or evergreens can look different depending. Sometimes they actually sort of go up or out. Sometimes it can help to look at pictures just to sort of get an idea. But for making this up, I sort of just tap my brush. I allow there to be gaps. I allow my pressure to just be very light. And you can go back up too and adjust the shape. You know, as long as you're working slow, you have control over it. And as long as your background is dry, it doesn't blend. I will mention too, I'm using a little less water in my paint. It's still fairly watery, as you can see there on my palette, but I'm not, overloading my brush with a ton of paint either. It just has kind of paint on the tips of the bristles. So I'm going to repeat this process and just fill in some trees and just use your judgment based on spacing. A lot of people like odds, maybe 3 trees, 5 trees, 7 trees, again, depending on how dense you want this to feel. And then like I did on the far left with that tree going up off the page, I'm also going to have some silhouetted trees going up off the page. But I'm going to go ahead and speed this next part up, and it will be a lot of repetition of the same thing, adding in trees, different heights, filling in that space. Next up, I'm going to add a little bit of detail to the rocks in the water and on the back there, just bringing in a little bit more texture now that it's dried. I can pop in a few areas, make it a little bit darker. That allows my first layer to appear more of a middle value, and now I'm putting in the darker value. Watercolor often works well working light to dark, so I can slowly build up that value and increase contrast and saturation as I want. So here I'm adding in some more with the water, just building up that layer and increasing some of the value, still allowing a little bit of that white to poke through, but I like to increase darkness in some areas, kind of around the rocks, around the edges. And this is a made-up imaginary landscape, so I'm not looking at anything and citing an actual source for light, but I just sort of like to imagine there's a few light areas as water moves and catches light and all of that. So you can add more layers as much as you want to. This is just a very simple landscape to show you, again, the layering process, working back to front, what wet on wet looks like versus wet on dry. And just to compare my two paintings, just for a little variety, similar idea, but slightly different.